And I believe that through the vehicle of Black liberation theology, we have the capacity to address and include the social and spiritual concerns of the millennial generation. So let's look at what Black liberation theology is in a nutshell. Can I do justice to that in 40 minutes? But I just want to take 5 minutes or so and address Black liberation theology and then move forward in the presentation. As I stated, Black liberation theology originated roughly in the mid 1960s. Some give an exact date to when Black liberation theology started. Some say it started on July 31st, 1966, when 51 Black pastors took out a full-page ad in the New York Times challenging the social norm of racism, and they were advocating for new avenues of how to combat systemic racism, not only in New York City, but also across the country. And they declared that that vehicle would be the Bible, to use the Bible not only as a salvific tool and instrument, but also as an instrument of liberation. Many view, and I believe Bishop would agree with me, that Dr. James Hal Cone is considered the father of Black liberation theology. He is a noted author and theologian who just left us, who passed away back in 2018. He wrote books such as A Black Theology of Liberation, God of the Oppressed, and one of his most recent writings before he passed was The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And Black liberation theology uh, is a dynamic source of theology because it stems from a theological thought that came out of liberation theology out of South America and the Roman Catholic movement by a man by the name of Gustavo Gutierrez. Black liberation theology addresses something that was missing in the Black religious experience, and that was Black perspective and Black context. Thus, we find that Black liberation theology is necessary to address the concerns and the critiques of Black Christians, which white Christianity and white theology often fails to address. James Hal Cone, who was the father of Black liberation theology, noted this in his memoirs, that he went through his theological education. He heard great theological theories presented by Niebuhr, Bonhoeffer, and many other European theologians, but he failed in all of his theological education to hear a Black perspective on theology and how it impacts the Black community. And so Black liberation theology emerged to address the social and religious needs of the Black community. Also, when we talk about the formation of Black liberation theology, it's important to note and understand that Dr. James Cone, also incorporated the perspectives of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. He viewed Black liberation theology as not something that was just a theological perspective, but also a social justice perspective, because oftentimes people try to separate theology and social justice, theology and humanity, but it is really impossible to separate theological perspective from the existence of injustice and immorality in society, because full theology embraces the human experience. And to say that we have a theological perspective that fails to embrace and include the struggles of humanity would be to diminish God. So when we look at Black liberation theology, it has a specific aim. And Black liberation theology focuses upon liberating Blacks from all forms of bondage, injustice, whether it's real or perceived, social, political, and economic and religious oppression. And when we look at the social context of our world today, we must admit that even though Black liberation theology was formed over 50 years ago, that it is still relevant and very much needed in society today. Because with all of the advancements that we've made from the civil rights era, the pre-civil rights era, it seems as if we're in a national tone now that has taken us back to where we were over 50 years ago. If we look at what happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, we look at the rise of hate groups, we look at the challenge and the attempted reconstruction of our own Black identity within this country, it is very much needed to have Black liberation theology as an active part of our religious and theological discussion and existence today. So when we look at the millennial generation, I think it is interesting because I think the millennial generation is repeating the same social struggle that the blacks faced, that we faced the blacks back in the 1950s and the 1960s. There's a measure of what I would call righteous discontent for what we are facing and what we are dealing with in society today. We made great advances over the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, maybe even the early 2000s in this country for African Americans. But now we find ourselves here in the last few years going back to some of the same old struggles that we thought was settled over 50 years ago. So now we find the millennial generation, in addition to their own cultural struggles, they're having to repeat the struggles of previous generations. So I think that when we look at the content and capacity of what Black liberation theology is, it speaks to the millennial generation and says that I am here to help you in this struggle. James Cone once defined Black liberation theology as a survival theology. He defined it as a survival theology in his book, a Black theology of liberation. He defined Black liberation theology as a theology of survival. And what he meant by that is, Cone asserted that Black liberation theology uh, must speak with a passion that is consistent with the depths and the wounds of the oppressed. And so he's really speaking to the relevancy of theology, because I think what we have to understand in the context of the church is that if we just preach and teach about getting to heaven, getting filled with the Holy Ghost, but yet we ignore the social and human struggles of society and our race as a people, then our theological perspective becomes very incomplete. So I think the church has a dynamic opportunity to reach the millennial generation, not so much by a diversity of methods, doing things that are contemporary, which those things are good and needed, but I think grabbing the theological essence of Black liberation theology, because I think it speaks directly and expressively to the issues that our millennial generation is facing. Because if we look at reality, they are trying to survive this world in which we live. When we look at the millennials, they are struggling with suicide rates as never before, dropout rates, educational disparity, economic oppression, political disenfranchisement, police brutality. There's a multitude of issues that could go on and on about what this millennial generation is facing in society. And when we look at the paradigm and the praxis of Black liberation theology, I believe it speaks directly to each and every issue that the millennial generation, particularly the Black millennial generation, is facing in our society. And I think the tragedy that the church makes at times is we don't speak directly to the issues and the theological issues of this emerging millennial generation. We just want to tell people we're going to get to heaven and everything is going to be okay when we get to heaven in the sweet by and by. But we have, through Black liberation theology, the ability and the capacity to speak the language of the millennial generation, to address their concerns from a biblical and theological perspective that doesn't speak to them, just speak to them, but includes them and embraces them, not only in the plight of society, but also in the theological views and practices of the church. So Black liberation theology is a theology of survival. When we look at the depths of Black liberation theology, particularly to the church, I think there's something of note that we must recognize today. And if you're taking notes, you can put this in your notes. According to Black liberation theology, there are three primary tasks of the church in the perspective of Black liberation theology. Three primary tasks of the church. Number one, Black liberation theology proclaims that the church should be proclaiming the reality of divine liberation. The church should be proclaiming the reality of divine liberation, which means, in essence, that the Lord doesn't just want to save our souls, but he wants to give us abundant life. He wants to give us liberation from the elements and forces of society and this wicked world that will oppress us as humanity and believers. So when we talk about millennials, I think that first task is very, very important, because when they come within the confines of the church to hear a message or a word from the Lord, they don't want to just get a Holy Ghost experience of where we shout the walls down, but they also want to hear the church proclaiming the reality of divine liberation, that whatever we're facing, whatever we're going through, whatever is oppressing us or holding us in bondage, that through the power of God and our theological perspective, that God will intervene and liberate us. And if you ever want to read a good book that speaks directly to this, I would recommend James Cone's book, The God of the Oppressed. And in this book, Dr. Cone shares his Black theological liberation perspective, that God sides with the oppressed, that God will not turn a blind eye to those that are suffering injustice, disenfranchisement, and oppression in this world. So I think when we're talking about trying to reach a millennial generation, we have to carry out that first task of the church according to Black liberation theology, and that is to proclaim the reality of divine liberation. The church has to give hope to this younger generation that what we're facing in this world is not eternal, is not concrete, that it is not immutable, but that through the activity of a divine God in our lives, that he has a willingness and a readiness to liberate us from what has us bound in this society. So the first task of the church, according to Black liberation theology, is to proclaim the reality of divine liberation. And I think if I could raise one more question, rhetorical question, on this first task, I think it is challenging for the church and us as believers to ask ourselves, if we are not proclaiming the reality of divine liberation, then what are we proclaiming? Are we telling people that they should settle for what they are facing? They should settle for injustice, immorality, and oppression, and wait until we go to heaven to be liberated? Or are we preaching a message that tells society and humanity that the God we serve has the power and authority to liberate us from oppressive forces while we are living here in this society in this time? The second task of the church, according to Black liberation theology, which I think is relevant for the millennial generation, is that the church not only preaches about divine liberation, but the church also has a willingness to share in the struggle for liberation. So that means that in trying to advocate Black liberation theology to a millennial generation, we cannot just become a rhetorical institution of where we are giving good theological rhetoric about what God can do and what should happen. But I think millennials need to see the church share in the liberation struggle with them and with society. And if we look back just probably a couple of generations ago to the 50s and the 60s, and maybe even a little bit prior to that time frame, I think that is what made the church so effective in reaching young people and those that were oppressed, is that the church not only gave rhetoric about what God's desire was for humanity, but the church became an advocate for humanity, and the church shared in the struggle for social justice and human rights. So from a perspective of Black liberation theology, we can share the relevance of this theological view with millennials from the praxis of getting the church engaged with society, getting the church engaged with the millennial generation, sharing in the struggles, not just that of the struggles that we face corporately as a race, but also those specific struggles that they face as a generation of people. So that means we have to be willing to step out of the box and sometimes our comfort zone and deal with issues as the church that might be uncomfortable to us, but are societal issues. Those issues of economics, sexuality, political oppression, that are very concrete realities of what the millennial generation is facing. And what we have to understand as the church is that if we do not address or speak to those issues, then the millennial generation will look to someone to give a voice for what they are facing. So the second task of the church, according to Black liberation theology, which I think is relevant for the millennial generation, is that millennials must see the church sharing in the struggle for liberation. And then the third task of the church, according to Black liberation theology, which I think is relevant to the millennial generation, engaging them, is the church as a fellowship has to become the visible manifestation of a gospel reality. The church as a fellowship must become a visible manifestation of a gospel reality. So, in other words, if the church is speaking to prosperity, then the church has to become a manifestation of prosperity. The church must produce prosperous people. We must be a prosperous institution, because it becomes paradoxical for myself or Bishop Luter or other pastors or theologians to talk about how God can prosper us, how God can liberate us, and we're selling chicken dinners in order to keep the lights on at the church. Or we are always broke and living lives of debt and economic oppression. So the church must become a sense or a source of the visible manifestation of a gospel reality. So the millennial generation, they're coming to church not just to hear our words, to experience our worship, but they want to see the living, breathing manifestation of the gospel within the context of our religious experience. They want to see the words of the Bible jump off of the page and become real in their midst. They want to see people healed, delivered, set free, liberated, empowered. So if we come with a message of the gospel and we say that Jesus saves, that Jesus wants to give you abundant life, but if the millennials look around the walls in the context of the church and the kingdom and they never see abundant life, now we have what I call a paradoxical tension that arises in the church, because now our rhetoric is not matching our reality. And what we have to understand is that with millennials, they are very time sensitive. So they are not going to give the church or the kingdom years and years and years to live out our reality and the manifestations of God. They want to come in to our boundaries and they want to see the gospel being manifested on a regular basis around us. So I think when we look at these three tasks of the church, proclaiming the reality of divine liberation, sharing in the struggle for liberation, and being a visible manifestation of a gospel reality, these things are critical in connecting with the millennial generation and sharing Black liberation theology with them. And I think if we look at what Black liberation theology is at its core, and what it is attempting to accomplish in the lives of not only Black America, but America as a whole, that it has the capacity to really energize the millennial generation even more than what they are now, to not only engage society, but to engage the church. Because the reality is, if we look around, many of our African American or Black congregations, for as a whole, the millennial generation is either disappearing or is quickly fading within the confines of the church. But I think that we have to understand that it's not gimmicks that will reach them, but it is sound and effective theology that is being manifested on a daily and regular basis within our lives. Going back to Black theology, Black liberation theology, I think it's important because some people will raise the question, well, why do we need to expound and advocate for Black liberation theology, particularly to this generation? Because Black liberation theology was birthed in the midst of a time and a season of racial despair, injustice, inequality. Why do we need that now? Because I believe while some of the cosmetics have changed, we are still struggling with some of the systemic issues. And I think within the confines of the Black church, we cannot be naive to think that all theology is our theology, because there are some theological perspectives and practices that are in many churches today that are multicultural churches, churches outside of our race and culture, that are not sensitive or inclusive to the Black experience. And I think that is where Black liberation theology becomes so very relevant to the millennial generation and the church as a whole today. Just look at our religious and spiritual climate today regarding the activities in the public square and politics. We have clergy across this country that are asserting that Donald Trump was sent by God, that the hand of the Lord is upon Donald Trump. We have white evangelicals that have many African Americans in their pews, and their ministries have been built by African Americans that have totally ignored the Black experience in this current season which we're in, but yet they want us to buy their books, to come to their conferences. And so I think in this spiritual climate, Black liberation theology is relevant to the church and must be re-engaged by the church, because everyone's theological perspective is not ours. Everyone in the kingdom who holds a social perspective is not ours. And I think that Black liberation theology has the capacity and the willingness to address those issues that are concerning to the millennial generation. I think also when we look at Black liberation theology and the millennial generation, I think that Black liberation theology is a great vehicle to reach the millennial generation because it speaks their language, it addresses their concerns. But I think it also that there is an unconscious existential synergy that exists between the millennial generation and Black liberation theology. There's an unconscious existential synergy and intersection that exists between Black liberation theology and the millennial generation. When we look at the millennial generations, three things I just want to address regarding the millennial generation and this synergy with Black liberation theology, and then I'll be done. I think when we look at the millennial generation, they are seeking identity. They are seeking identity. The millennial generation ask themselves over and over and over again, who am I? Who are we in the midst of this world? I remember when I was a child, my father, I think he's probably just a few years older than Bishop Luter, but this was probably in Bishop Luter's generation too. That there was this saying that my dad used to be part of the Black Panthers years and years ago, but it was a saying, I'm Black and I'm proud. And I don't know if y'all remember that saying or not, I'm Black and I'm proud. So I remember as a child of the 70s, hearing that said around me, having it handed down. We knew who we were because it was instilled in us from a Black perspective, that there's nothing wrong with being Black, that we could wear our afros, our dashikis, even in the 80s, the Jerry curls that dripped, and everything was okay. But now this generation, I think they struggle with identity. We struggle with Blackness because I think one of the fallacies that occurred after we elected our first African-American president in Barack Obama is that there was this rush from both the white community and the Black community to say that we are now living in this post-racial society, that race no longer matters because we have now elected a Black president to the highest office in the land. And I think that some of us lived in that fairy tale for a while until Donald Trump was elected, until they said, we're going to make America great again. And so I think millennials struggle with identity because society tries to tell them who they are versus having a biblical indoctrination that tells them who they are, or even a strong Black community that instills in them who we are as a people and a culture. And I think that's one of the things that we lack now versus, excuse me, 30 or 40 years ago regarding identity. So Black liberation theology, I think to millennials, gives a concrete identity, because one thing with Black liberation theology, I think that it expounds that over time, over generations, over societal conditions, that our blackness does not change. And I use the term blackness because that's a Black liberation theology term more so than African American. Our blackness does not change over generations. I think that we can say that as things change, the more they stay the same over generational cultures, because there are some cosmetic changes, but I think we still struggle with some of the same core systemic issues. So Black liberation theology, I think, speaks to the whole issue of identity within the millennial generation, which sometimes they struggle with. There is an irrevocable identity with our Blackness that is embedded within Black liberation theology. When you read James Cone's book, A Black Theology of Liberation, that was written, I believe, in 1968, it still holds relevancy to 2019. As you read this book and read a lot of his works, and if you ever indulge in the principles of Black liberation theology, they seem to be timeless, because there are some systemic issues that fail to change over time within our culture, our Black community, and some of the oppressive forces which we face. And I find, as a preacher, as a pastor, that whether I'm teaching in seminary or preaching from the pulpit, teaching a Bible study lesson, that when I expound upon the principles of Black liberation theology, it apprehends the mind and the attention of young millennials that are hearing that talk. I've even had a group of millennials within my church and community that have asked me to consider teaching a class on Black liberation theology in the near future, because of the interest level and how it connects with them. Secondly, I think Black liberation theology has synergy with the millennial generation, because Black liberation theology offers up a resistance to social, racial, political, economic oppression and other forms of oppression that we face within our society. From Cone's perspective, when he says that God sides with the oppressed, you can really make a philosophical argument, while his focus is upon Black Americans, that Blackness could be expanded to Latinos, poor whites, anyone that is facing oppressive norms within our society and our culture, and needs God to intervene for liberation. Uh, so I think when you talk about Black liberation theology, it transcends time and collaborates with the resistance that millennials are waging in this current time. For example, with groups and organizations, movements like Black Lives Matter, I think they coincide a lot with the philosophical and theological norms of Black liberation theology. When you look at how we are dealing with economic oppression in our country, educational oppression, right here in the city of Rochester. I don't know if you saw it there on your end of New York, but we made national news last week. We had high school students and young people that were protesting and marching in the streets of Rochester against the Board of Education for the state of our educational system. The city of Rochester has the second worst city school district in the country, behind Detroit. And the school board just voted on this past week to lay off over 200 teachers and staff in an already school district that is dysfunctional. So I think when we talk about Black liberation theology and how it strives to advocate for the liberation of people against oppressive systems, it speaks to the millennial generation. And I think that it's a tragedy when we are not aware of Black liberation theology and how to connect it with the millennial generation. And then the last point I have of how I think Black liberation theology and the millennial generation connect with each other is that millennials are thirsty for what is relevant and what is impactful. They don't want to just sit in church for 2 or 3 hours and go home with just a good feeling and nothing has changed in their lives or in their culture. And I think Black liberation theology shares in that thirst, not to just be something that is rhetorical, but something that is impactful in changing society. So I think that we as the church, we as theologians, as pastors, bishops, apostles, reverend doctors, we have a great opportunity to share Black liberation theology with a new generation and to get them to explore their possibilities of what they can accomplish in their generational movement and culture through Black liberation theology to transform society, transform the kingdom, and also to transform themselves as individuals. So I think that Black liberation theology is not only relevant to the church as a whole, but I think that it is relevant to the millennial generation. And I think that the church ought to use Black liberation theology as a tool and a resource to reach the millennial generation, to engage them, to transform them, and to have some sense of solidarity in the struggles, the passions, and the advocacy that the millennial generation is seeking in society. Bishop Luter, I'm back in your hands for questions, discussion.
Wow.
Thank you.
Well, let's give Dr. McReynolds another hand. I am sure you see now why I was so anxious to have him come share with us and to make him a part of our lineup of speakers and lecturers that we have on a monthly basis. And I think I can speak for the class. Dr. McReynolds, you have been so impactful in your presentation, so I get a sense that they may want me to include you in the 2020 lineup.
I'll be glad to.
I'll be glad to. There were several who came in after we did our introductions, and so I want you to get a sense of the others who are in the room as well. Those who didn't get a chance to introduce themselves, would you quickly do so? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Terry Wilson. I'm from Deliverance Baptist Church, and I read up a little bit about you. That's why I came in this morning, because I wanted to hear your presentation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Great. Who else came in a little late? Yes.
From Deliverance Baptist Church.
Bless you. Bless you. Anybody else come in a little late? Yes, ma'am.
Good morning. My name is Bonzel Hogwood. I'm from Faith Deliverance Christian Center. I really enjoyed everything that you said today. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
My name is Warren Hogwood from Faith Deliverance Christian Center. I thank you for your presentation. Yes, absolutely tremendous.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it. Enjoyed it.
I think that's all about late arrivals. Now, I did give, and I don't want you to think that Dr. McReynolds is abbreviating or has any shortage of material. The outline that I gave him was a 40 to 45 minute class instruction with ample time for Q&A at the end. We do have an event that's going on just a little later on today, and so we're going to have to vacate the room maybe a few minutes early, but I didn't want that to impose a limitation on our experience with Dr. McReynolds today. So I limited him to about 40 minutes today. He had, as you know, and as you can see, he could have gone on much longer. But I wanted you to have an opportunity to interact with him via your questions. Now, I've been listening to Dr. McReynolds, and Doctor, here is what they're responsible for retaining from your presentation today. So I want you to put these down because this may impact some of the questions that you want to ask Dr. McReynolds. You may want to solicit an answer or have him go over an item or two based upon the study questions from his lecture today. Number one, in what particular decade does Dr. McReynolds argue Black liberation theology was birthed in? In what decade does he say the movement was birthed in? Number two, in what particular newspaper does Dr. McReynolds say that 21 pastors took out a full-page ad? In what particular newspaper does Dr. McReynolds say that 21 pastors took out? 51. Okay. 51. So that's why I'm asking you the number of pastors. I'm asking you what newspaper.
Oh, you just say that. Which one?
Right.
What
In what newspaper did 51 pastors take out a full-page ad? Number three, who is considered the father of Black liberation theology? Who is considered the father of Black liberation theology? Next question. What two figures of the 1960s did the founder of Black theology lean? What two figures from the 1960s does Black theology lean and defend? 1960s. What two leaders? Leaders. Civil rights leaders, actually.
I'm sorry. What two leaders of the 1960s Black theology
Did Black theology defend? Lean on, yeah. Or defend. Lord. Next question. It's the fifth question. Who was the South American figure that greatly influenced Black theology? Who was the South American figure that greatly influenced Black theology? Next question.
Hey, you're fast.
You may want to ask him how to spell it, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Next question. In Dr. McReynolds' lecture, he referred to Black theology as what kind of theology? He referred to it as what kind of theology?
Theology is what kind of theology?
What kind of theology?
Black theology.
Yeah. Next question. According to Dr. McReynolds, how many paths are there in Black liberation theology? How many paths are there? Next question. Name any of those paths that he discussed. First question is how many did he give? And then the next question is give me any one of the number that he gave. Okay, beloved, get this. Dr. McReynolds argues that Black liberation theology is relevant to what generation? Dr. McReynolds argues that Black liberation theology is relevant to what generation? Is that 10?
No.
That's 9?
Yes.
Oh, we need one more question. We need one.
It's nine.
You're not only late, but you're behind as well. 9? Doctor, give them a test question. What 10th item would you want them to know?
Oh, Black liberation theology fills a void that is often left by what demographic of church culture? Black liberation theology fills a void that is often left by what area of religious culture?
Good. Void.
Black liberation theology fills a void that is left by what area of religious culture? I did state that in the lecture.
Yeah, he did. All right, questions for Dr. McReynolds? Any question you want to ask?
Can you give me the spelling of the name? Gustavo.
Gustavo Gutierrez. G-U-S, T as in Tommy, A, V as in Victor, O, Gustavo Gutierrez, G-U-T as in Tommy, I-E-R-R-E-Z. And he was a theologian from Peru, Peruvian theologian that wrote a lot of liberation theology.
I have a question. And thank you so much. I understand exactly what you're saying. I agree with you. Do you feel it's a problem sometimes with getting the older generation when you're trying to do the liberation, Black liberation theology, to come not to totally forget about fire and brimstone, but even when Bishop is sometimes teaching, I hear them mumble and afterwards like, I ain't come here for that. I want fire and brimstone. I want, how do you get the older generation to realize that we're trying to connect and we're not giving up?
I think that's a great question. I think the answer lies within the hermeneutical capacity of the preacher, him or herself, to intertwine the principles of Black liberation theology with the preaching of the gospel, the check in the mail, you're going to get delivered, saved, and healed. And I think from a preaching perspective that you can integrate the two messages and make them irrevocable, make them relevant to where they are received by multi-generations that are in the audience. I think you also have to rely upon the influence of the Holy Spirit to open doors and to show you where doors are open to make those presentations. But I think it's very much possible to integrate the two realms together. And I think Bishop Luter is a great example of that. If you listen to his preaching and his teaching as a founding father, the full gospel that can teach you and lead you to get full of the Holy Ghost, he also maintains a message that keeps you socially relevant and culturally relevant. So I think that from the disciplines of the preacher, we have a responsibility of how to intertwine those disciplines in our preaching and our delivery.
Thank you.
And I also want to insert here, and I'm sure that Dr. McReynolds will agree, that part of the reason that Black theology had a challenge in the mid-'60s and the late '60s and even the early '70s is because it was drawn from a more global approach to liberation theology. Black liberation theology is a branch of the large liberation theology. There was a global movement of liberation theology where people around the globe were disconnecting themselves from colonial ideas globally. And so Black theology was a branch of that. But because it came out of South America, and Gustavo Gutierrez was closely identified and associated with Marxism, not communism, but Marxism, and liberation theology on a whole was viewed in part, if I'm not mistaken, as a part of the worldwide Marxist movement. So there was hesitancy on the part of Americans to affirm a theology that was associated with a global theology that had some leanings and identification with Marxism and the Marxist movement. Now, to bring it full circle, that liberation theology, especially in South America, was in response to overarching colonial ideas in South America. And it is not by accident, beloved, that the current Pope of the Roman Catholic Church comes from South America and is a product of the very movement that we're talking about. So some of the radicalism that you see in the Roman Catholic Church is a result of the current Pope being ideologically friendly to the global liberation movement. Am I right?
Very much so, Bishop. Very much so. The current Pope is as you said, a product of that early liberation theology movement. And there's also a piece of literature that Cone wrote called what Marxism says to Black liberation theology. That's also very important in building that ideological foundation. So that's very true.
Other questions?
I'm sorry.
Yes, ma'am. Quick, Doctor, then we'll come back.
You said the author of the oppression book is James Cone, C-O-N-E?
Yes, C-O-N-E, James Cone, God of the Oppressed.
Thank you.
And what Dr. McReynolds has given you an insight and a glimpse of is why you continue, because I am a product of the same era, and it is part of my own theological foundation. So when you hear Bishop Luda say to you and teach to you time and time again that the God of the oppressed is not the God of the oppressor, or that the religion of the oppressed is not the same as the religion of the oppressor, I am borrowing from the vocabulary and the ideology of what Dr. McReynolds is talking to you about today. That's why you hear me say that so much. When I make this distinction that the Christianity of the oppressor is not the same Christianity as the oppressed, it's coming straight from this book, God of the Oppressed. Yes, ma'am.
You said that the millennials are struggling with identity. Do you think there's a disconnect between, like, they don't want to hear from us about, oh, you keep talking about slavery and this and that, but if they realize, like, when James Brown came out with Say It Loud, I'm Black and Proud, he was trying to give us some, identity, some to be proud of. They're running around still, now they're, calling each other nigga, and, it seems like there's a little disconnect here. They're lost because they don't have the history. And I love the way Bishop, we're now learning about the early Christian fathers and how they were from, Black. And if they would just come and listen to what we're learning, I don't know. It just seems like there's a disconnect.
I think there has been a great disconnect generationally, and I think part of that has been the social breakdown in the post-segregation era. One of the things that I addressed in my doctoral dissertation is that segregation was not managed very well by us because there were some things that we forfeited after segregation that were concrete to our advancement as a people. I think after the segregation era, had such a thirst to assimilate and emulate and integrate into the dominant culture that we left some core values behind that made us who we are. So I think when you look at the role of parenting, youth in society in the 70s, 80s, 90s, it was vastly different than the 60s. There was more of a domestic discipline, per se, in the household in the pre-desegregation era than what we had. I think we had a disconnect from the church and other elements of our society that had a layered effect upon the emerging generations and just how they view themselves, family relations, and societal relations.
That's good. There was one that I didn't hear. What was the paper, the 51 pastors?
New York Times.
Thank
New
you.
York Times.
New York Times, yes.
Yes, right here.
Could they speak up? I can barely hear whoever's asking the question.
Okay. You spoke of the millennial generation is seeking identity. What was the second thing they were seeking? Offers of resistance to what?
The second thing that I stated was the resistance to oppression in the areas of social oppression, racial oppression, political oppression, and economic oppression. And basically just stating that the millennial generation they are what I call sometimes a movement generation. They want to embrace causes. They want to resist things that are oppressive in society. So we have to develop that synergy with them on resistance to social, racial, political, and economic oppression.
Yes, ma'am.
You said one of the three of the primary tasks of the church, you said, was to share in the liberation struggle, economic sexuality. How do you do the sexuality part without condemning and you're going to burn in hell for being gay? And how do you bring them in? How do you do that?
I think the church, and when I say sexuality, I think that the church has to first just be willing to talk about sexuality. And when I say sexuality, I don't mean just people that are gay, lesbian. I mean just sexuality, period. When I came to the church that I am now and I talked about sex, they said it's the first time probably in ever or 50 years or more that they heard somebody from the pulpit address sex. And I think when the church fails to give a voice to sexuality and sexual issues in our society, then we open a door for someone else to take our voice and take control of the narrative. Now, my indoctrination is when we talk about homosexuality, it's a sin. The Bible is plain and clear on that. And with me, you cannot deviate or compromise on that matter. And I've taken some heat on that. But I think that society will at least respect our views and our stance when we show that we can still love the humanity of people while we might not agree with the lifestyle or the sin of their behavior. And I think that the struggle that the church has with sexuality now is, and particularly in that area with homosexuality, is that there are some radical elements that want the church to say that homosexuality is not a sin, and it is. But I think that the church, Jesus died for everyone, for the drunk, the drug addict, the homosexual. And I think that the church has to always have an inclusive message that restoration and reconciliation is available to all. So I think we have the capacity to love the sinner and hate the sin.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
It's more of a comment. You were speaking about understanding the millennials, and I think that that's like an important part that we have to acknowledge that, like she was saying, a disconnect. We may not even understand some of the things they're going through, and that we have to first have that dialogue to understand where they're coming from before we begin to teach and direct change to them. We have to understand where they're coming from, and I think right now there's so much going on with them that we don't understand. The older generation.
Correct. We have to understand where they're coming from. And I think that goes into what I said, the second task of the church is in sharing with their struggle. We have to do relationship building and sit down and talk with millennials, have relational experiences with them, find out what they are struggling with, what they are facing, and how we can have some solidarity with them in their struggles. And I think the mistake that the church often makes is we want to talk to individuals before we talk with individuals. And so I think that it's important that we as the institution of the church spend time with millennials and engage them and not always view them as a part of the church of tomorrow, but they are part of the church right now. And we have to make them feel as if that is so and integrate them into our relations and what we do.
Yes. Examples? It's just, how do you get them in? Like, what an example of it showing them integration? Like,
I think, okay, you said examples. How do we get them in? I think that speaks directly to the task that the church has. Sometimes before we get them in, we have to go to them. So that means we might have to be as Jesus and make the church portable and take the church outside of the four walls. Because the reality is some millennials will never come inside the church seeking Jesus, but we have to carry him outside of the church to where they are and then lead them back into the church. We're doing some things this upcoming year to take the church out into the marketplace. I'm going to be doing some Bible studies and just some Bible discussions in some coffee shops, on some college campuses, and out in the community. So I think the mistake we make sometimes is out of innocence. How do we get them into the church? And sometimes because of stereotypes, experiences, the church becomes a symbol of something that they don't want. So we have to take the church out and I think reconstruct the church in their minds of who the church is. I'm working on a book, and my first book, and the title of it is going to be I Love God, but I Hate Doing Church. And I think that speaks directly to the tension that exists between the institution of the church and millennials and also just other people in general, is that sometimes we become so churchy that the aspect of the concept of doing church becomes such a turnoff to young people and others that they will never come into the church until they see a different advertisement from the church.
That's good. Go ahead, Ray. You can't get it together.
It's a lot, but I think it's, as I'm listening, and again, it's a comment and a question, but we have to address, like what we're doing now as the church, our perspective of church and what it means. And I think that the whole concept of Black liberation theology speaks to the way that we do church, our own thinking, and how we deal with, you know, the millennials or anyone else for that matter in regards to the way the church is. For example, we have a ministry that works with young men in the community. We feed them, and some of these young men are still gangbanging, whatever they're doing, they just come the way that they are. But I really struggle with doing the ministry as if I was almost wrong by taking the ministry to a public location, because I kind of just knew or sensed at the time I weren't going to be able to get the men to come into the church. So we do the ministry in a public location. And so I'm just saying that to say that we have to first process, because the whole thing was, am I doing something contrary or indifferent to the church because I'm not doing it at the church? There's a basement in the church.
Right, exactly.
I'm just saying the context of what we're discussing when you say the church. Not meaning literally, but the building and all that goes on in the church.
And I think part of what we have to address in that is changing our perspective of what the church is, because I think we have reduced the church to a scripture, an A and B selection, and a sermon to being church. But when we go out and we feed the hungry, we evangelize to the lost, when we engage in things in the public square, that's just as much church as an A and B selection and wearing white on the first Sunday. So I think it starts with us changing our perspective of what church is.
That's what I was trying to say. You said that.
Hi, to Minister Reggie's point, as a therapist who's a Christian, I often try to find ways to bring church like this to my clients, because that is often the missing piece with them moving forward. And I have this one particular client who grew up Catholic, but she doesn't believe in anything. She believes in something, but not the dynamic of church. And so she said one time she's white, and she has like some Black friends who go to non-Catholic churches, and she's like, they're so lively, and they raise their hands, and they're clapping, and all these things. And she says that sometimes the raising of the hands, because she doesn't understand it, scares her and it weirds her out. And so when I tell her, so when our therapy session is over and we have Keisha and X, Y, and Z time, she allows me to go there with her, but she always feels bad because she's like, I just don't believe what you're saying, and I don't want to say that to you because I don't want to offend you. And I think one of the things with talking to people is to understand that they may not believe the same thing we believe, and we don't have to be offended when they question what we believe. Because I would tell her, you know, how much of a Christian am I if you can't ask me a question and I answer it from my perspective of my belief, because your disbelief isn't going to sway my belief. I hope my belief sway your disbelief. So I think that that's also very important, especially with millennials as a, I guess millennial-ish, as a millennial, being open, or at least the older generation, being open to a young person coming up to them saying, I don't believe what you believe, this ain't right, this is this is that, and not being offended, to have an open dialogue and discussion on why they may feel the way they feel. Because what I always find is they just feel that way because of what we call church hurt, but it's really people hurt.
Yeah. It's not, I don't think.
And I think we have to be open to the reality that church is a diverse institution. Just because someone dances in the spirit and runs a lap around the sanctuary does not mean they have any more Holy Ghost than someone that just sits there and sheds a tear. So I think we have to be open to the diversity of the church, the diverse moves of the Holy Spirit in the lives of believers and the church.
So I wanted to add to what she was saying, which is absolutely true. Like a lot of I think the Christians, they do not know how to interact with the disbelievers, the non-believers. So they need to be educated, trained in the church how to approach these kinds of people, and that's what we're like.
And I think one thing that is very impactful is some of the vehicles like people like Bishop Luter are making available when we have discussions like this that might be online, or you have media or digital dialogues and Bible studies that are made available to people. I find that those are great draws to get people to be open and receptive to church, to Jesus, and to engaging our faith community. To be honest with you, our church has grown tremendously in the 3 years that I've been here. And I think a lot of that growth has been attributed to things that we've done on social media, where it's just discussions. We don't have anyone singing. I'm not on there hooping and stomping my feet, but I'm just talking about Jesus or the kingdom or relevant issues. And those things tend to be a trigger to bring people into the kingdom more rapidly than just the A and B selection.
Great. Sister Benson and then Sister Wilson. Then we
Well,
want
I
to
just have a comment. I think I came prepared and we were supposed to talk about should there be images of Jesus? Then we should be images of Jesus. And our character should be like Jesus. And when Jesus was out among the people, he demonstrated the power of God. And so we should be able to demonstrate the power of God. Like the sister said, we should be trained. Just don't go out there. You know, you got to go out trained and have knowledge and have experience and have the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit to guide you, and have the spirit of discernment to know so that how to deal with people. And sometimes people don't know how to deal with people. That's why we have to. So yeah, there should be images of Jesus.
Great. Wilson.
Dr. Reynolds, what is your take on the Kanye West worship experience as you see it?
I haven't had a chance to really study up on what Kanye has been doing. I've been following it loosely in the media. I'm interested in theologues like Bishop Luter speaking to that more so than myself. But I look at it from two perspectives. I think that on one hand, it can be a positive force to bring people to the kingdom, to expand the audience of the gospel, which is always good. But then being a still somewhat of an old school preacher, a fourth generation preacher, someone like Bishop that is multi-generational in the calling, I think at times it's too easy to become a preacher. And that, I think, long term can open some doors to some undisciplined areas that might not be healthy for the kingdom. So with me, I think the verdict is still out on Kanye. I haven't really followed his message and his practices enough to make a concrete assessment of what he's doing. But I think anyone that promotes Jesus and lifts his name higher is a plus to just bring people and attention to the cross. But I pray that if he is serious about doing this long term, that he will take some time and go sit at the feet of someone like Bishop Luter or sit in the classroom to make sure that the rhetoric and the pedagogy that he's giving is sound doctrine.
Come on, let's give Dr. McReynolds what a wonderful experience Amen. Thank you so much, sir. And
Thank you.
to continuing this fellowship again in the future. Let's give him a hand again.
Thank you, Bishop.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Talk to you soon.